Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What paranormal things did you experience in your childhood? Story 1. Voices in the Night.
My house growing up was built in the 1920s. While I can think of several explanations for many of the strange occurrences, such as sleep paralysis, childlike imagination, creaky pipes, and faulty wiring, there were some things that left me and my family members deeply unsettled. I generally believe that most hauntings can be explained by natural phenomena, and I am happy to think this could be the case here as well. From the moment we moved into the house, I was 6 years old. I absolutely hated my closet. I would cry if my parents did not close it at night. This fear never went away, even when I became a teenager. I always had to have it closed or covered up. I cannot explain exactly how terrifying this feeling was, but I always felt watched. My entire family was creeped out by that closet too, and we generally avoided it. The upstairs was small and had a landing surrounded by 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. I would sometimes wake up with this oddly unsettled feeling and find myself walking to the landing and staring down into the darkness of the stairs. This was unusual for me, as I normally sprinted to the bathroom and back if I needed to go at night. A few times I would find my brother already standing there, but instead of looking downstairs, he would be staring up at our attic door. Those moments gave me a fright every single time. The strangest experiences were the times when someone in my family heard a voice that sounded like one of us, but we were not there. On at least 2 occasions, my dad came into my room annoyed at me for waking him up. He said I had tapped him hard on the shoulder and very clearly told him to get up because I needed help. However, when he opened his eyes, I was not there, and he had to search the house to find me. Both times, I was deep asleep in my bed, tangled in the sheets. My brother also told me about times when he heard me talking in a room. But when he checked, I was not even upstairs. To this day, it still gives me chills to think about it. There were other times when I clearly heard the front door open and my mum call for my brother and me to come downstairs. However, when we got to the living room, no one was home. It was so strange because both of us distinctly heard it, even with headphones in. Sometimes the experiences would unsettle us so much that we left the house entirely. Other strange occurrences included things going completely missing and then turning up in odd places months later. I have always tried to explain this away as us forgetting where we had put them or maybe the cats hiding them. However, some instances were so bizarre that even now I cannot shake the feeling that something else was happening. Some of my friends refused to come over after spending a night at the house. They would not give me any specific details, only saying that the place made them feel very uncomfortable.
Story 2. Creepy Guest Room.
I was about 9 years old, playing with some Star Trek action figures in my bedroom. Yes, I considered myself a cool kid. My room was directly above a guest room that was almost never used, and I almost never went inside. The furniture in that room was outdated compared to the rest of the house, and it always gave off a creepy vibe. This detail will be important later. I had a Spock action figure that could easily come apart. His shirt could snap into 2 pieces by pressing on the seam, and then all his limbs would detach. He was simple to put back together, so I would often take him apart. I used him in scenes where I pretended someone had been injured or killed by an alien. One day I had just set up a rather elaborate and dramatic Star Trek scene when my mom called me down for dinner. After eating, I returned to my room and immediately noticed that Spock was gone. Just him, though. All the other action figures were still in a little circle exactly as I had left them. I searched everywhere that evening before bed, thinking that my younger brother, my only sibling, who was 2 years old at the time, might have somehow gotten into my room and moved my things. It had never happened before, but it was the only explanation I could think of. However, the whole family had been at dinner, and there was no opportunity for anyone to go upstairs and touch anything. The next morning, I continued searching for Spock. I checked everywhere. He was not in the living room, not put away by mistake, and not in my brother's room. It was baffling. Finally, as a last effort, I decided to check the guest room. That room looked untouched, as it always did. Except for one thing, a dismantled Spock action figure, lying in the exact same arrangement I had left him in my room the previous night, directly below where I had been playing with him. I asked my mom and dad if they had moved it. They both said they knew nothing about it. My younger brother could not have gone down the stairs on his own, and certainly would not have been able to replicate the same arrangement of the action figure. It was as if my toy had somehow moved a few feet downward, right through the floor. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. It remains one of the most puzzling and unsettling moments from my childhood.
Story 3. Trapped in a room.
When I was a kid, my brother and I shared a bunk bed. But when we moved into a bigger house, we each got our own rooms. I took the top half of the bunk, which left me with 2 footboards, but no headboard. The posts at the top were about ear height when I sat on the edge of my bed, so I placed my stereo speakers on top, facing inward toward me. One evening I was listening to some Motley Crue, lost in the music, sitting cross-legged in the middle of my bed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and held my head in my hands for a moment, when suddenly something heavy and sharp slammed into the back left of my head. The force of it was enough to make me bleed heavily. I sprang up, clutching my scalp, and staggered down the hall and stairs, leaving a trail of blood behind me to find my mother in the kitchen. She helped stop the bleeding, and we rushed to the emergency room where the doctor stapled my scalp back together. When we returned home, we went straight to my room to try to make sense of what had happened. That's when we found one of my stereo speakers, the one that had been on my right, lying on the floor in front of my bed. The corner of the speaker was covered in blood. There was no way it could have fallen off the post, let alone hit me with the force it did. It made no sense, and to this day, we couldn't explain it. For weeks after that night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in that room. It felt wrong, like something had been lurking there, waiting for me. The fear lingered. Then, years later, I was back in my old room when something strange happened. A sconce on the wall flickered before flashing an eerie green light. It went out right after, leaving the room in unsettling silence. It was probably just a faulty bulb, but considering the room's history, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of that space. The room that had nearly claimed me once now felt like it was still alive, haunted by something I couldn't explain. Whatever it was, it seemed to be waiting for me to make a mistake again.
Story 4. Dying man in the playroom.
My great-aunt's house was built in 1792, a place full of history and mystery. The upstairs room, a small attic space with a sloping ceiling, was turned into a playroom for us kids. It should have been a fun escape, but instead it became a source of unease. As a child, I didn't understand why I could never feel truly comfortable in that room. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore either. Looking back, maybe it was just an overactive imagination, or perhaps it was a bad dream that stuck with me. But before it was a playroom, I remember it as the room of a dying man. His bed was in the far corner, and I vividly remember his frail, suffering figure. He looked as though he was barely hanging on, his pain palpable. I never felt safe in that room, even when the others were around. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched or the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. If I ever had to go in there alone, I couldn't stand to be in it for more than a few minutes before my skin would crawl, and I'd rush out. I'm not the type to believe in the supernatural. I've always considered myself a skeptic. While my husband has had his own paranormal encounters, I've never had any experiences that would make me think the supernatural was real. He's even had to pull me out of supposedly haunted places when I just didn't feel anything. I would wander the dark halls of haunted hotels late at night, half expecting to find something that would convince me, something to make me believe. But that room in my great-aunt's house was different. There was an energy there that couldn't be explained. It wasn't just my childhood imagination running wild. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the past was somehow still clinging to it, refusing to let go. I avoided that room whenever possible, and if I ever had to go in, I made it as quick as possible, grabbing whatever I needed and leaving. I don't know what happened in that room, but I never could shake the feeling that it held a dark, lingering secret.
Story 5. Strange noises at 3 a.m.
My dad's house was built on the site of the original house that had been completely flattened by a tornado. I slept upstairs in my room, and next to my bed was a vent that allowed me to see directly down into the basement. If I looked over the edge of the bed, the basement was unfinished, a dark and cold space. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night. Around 3 a.m. I'd look down, and the light in the basement would be on. I always felt uneasy because the light should not have been on. All the bedrooms were on the main floor, and the basement was far from any of them. I would go to the bathroom, and by the time I returned, the light would be off. It could have been my imagination, but something about it felt off. This same house had strange occurrences that went beyond the basement light. I had a touch lamp in my room, one with 3 brightness settings. Each touch would make the light dimmer or brighter until it finally turned off after the 4th touch. But something eerie always happened at night. The lamp would flash, despite my efforts to turn it off by tapping it quickly. I could never make it just flash once and then shut off. Each time I tried, it took about 3 to 4 seconds to cycle through the 3 settings and then finally go dark. And it only happened at night, when everything was quiet. But the most terrifying experience came one night when I was sound asleep. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sudden, deafening sound of my stereo system blaring at full volume. I was terrified as I lay there in the darkness, hearing the music at an impossible level. My heart raced as I scrambled to turn it off. But it was too late. The entire house had woken up. Everyone rushed to my room asking, "What was that?" The terror I felt in that moment is something I have never experienced again. Waking up to such a loud sound in the middle of the night, with everything else in total darkness, left me shaken and scared to be alone in that house. The strange, inexplicable events that kept happening in that house made me think it was haunted. At the very least, something in that house didn't want to be forgotten, lingering just outside of sight, but always there, making its presence known.
Story 6. The Midnight Walkers.
When I was younger, we lived in a ranch-style house, meaning a long hallway with rooms on either side. My room was at the end of the hall on the left, and the master bedroom was at the end on the right. The end of the hallway also led to the exterior wall of the house. My parents had a small television in their room that they would leave on while they fell asleep. If the television was still on and they were asleep, I would sneak into their room, lie under their bed with my dog, and watch reruns of Dragnet. This was usually on around the time I snuck over. One night, my dog and I were lying under the bed when the hall began to glow with a pale green light. The light kept getting stronger and brighter. As I was seeing this light, the hair on my dog's neck and back began to rise, and he got into an aggressive posture. However, he did not make a sound. He was always very protective of me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a shadowy, illuminated green figure slowly walk by the door, followed by a smaller figure, and then a third smaller figure, all adult-sized. All three were looking straight ahead and walking as though they had somewhere to go. Now, mind you, the hallway ended maybe 18 inches past the edge of the doorframe and was also the exterior wall of the house. Right after the third figure passed the doorframe, the light in the hallway disappeared, and there was a dim green light coming from the yard. I jumped out from under the bed, ran to a recliner, and looked out the window. I watched the three figures continue to walk through our side yard and up the hill into the woods. If there was a door where they exited, it would have been on the second story. There was no deck, no window, just the side of the house. Decades later, as I am writing this, I can vividly recall exactly what I saw, and the hair on my neck stands up.
Story 7. Monsters Under the Bed.
After my parents divorced when I was 6, I moved to 9 or 10 different houses. The first house we moved from, and nearly all of the others, had signs that they were haunted. I have 3 sisters, but I will only talk about one in these stories. In the original house, I would see shadowy figures at night. My mum would often hear the sound of children laughing and playing when everyone was fast asleep. We had this light in the upstairs hallway that never worked. It hadn't worked for over a year. We changed the light bulb multiple times and even had an electrician come to check it out. He couldn't find any reason why it shouldn't work. The wiring was fine. Everything was okay, but it still didn't work. One night, the light turned on. My sister stepped out into the hallway saying, "Hey Mom, look, the light's working." As soon as she spoke those words, the light turned off and never worked again. In the next house, things got even worse. My mum, my sister, and I would often hear babies crying and old men talking when no one else was in the house. We lived far enough from our neighbours that there was no chance it could be them. At night, I would hear scratching at my door. It wasn't like a rat or a rodent, it was more like huge scratching, like a big dog. We didn't have any pets, and no one else ever heard it. One time, my sister and Mum were standing in the hallway when suddenly a bedroom door swung open. Shoes flew out one by one, and the shoe rack in the room toppled over. There was no one in the room, and both my sister and Mum were standing outside. Another time, I was home alone and watched a massive antique bookcase move at least 5 inches from the wall by itself. In the next house, we had a kitten who would sometimes meow or hiss at nothing at the walls or random spots in the room. We never figured out why. Now, in the house we live in, lights, televisions, and ceiling fans will randomly turn on by themselves. Just a month ago, my mum was breastfeeding my baby sister when she looked up and said, "There's a monster under the bed, Mummy." As soon as she said that, the ceiling fan in her room turned on. This strange and terrifying activity seems to follow us. It's not just in our house, but at my stepfamily's houses as well. It feels like something is constantly watching, lurking just out of sight.
Story 8. Unseen Presence in the Dark.
When I was about 10 years old, my family moved into an older house that had been built in the late 1970s. A few days after we moved in and were settling, my parents went out with some friends, leaving me and my little sister at home for about an hour. Bedtime eventually came around, and I snuggled into bed, knowing my parents would be home soon and all would be well. As I lay there, adjusting to my new room and trying to fall asleep, my closed door suddenly jiggled open. Then I heard a distinct sound of the door being pushed inward. Thinking it was my little sister, I glanced over, only to see a figure as tall as the door frame and wide enough to fill the doorway. The figure stood there, dark and ominous, simply staring. Now my parents are tall, but not that tall, and there was no way it could have been them. They are slim, and I would have heard them coming in. My room was right next to the wooden staircase leading to the front door, which would creak, and it was also directly above the garage, which had a very noisy old door. It was eerily quiet as I stared at the looming figure. I could also see that my sister's door, which had previously been slightly cracked, was now wide open. Her door was difficult to push since it dragged on the carpet, so there was no way it could have swung open on its own, especially since I was the one who had nearly closed it for her. I was too terrified and tired to do anything or question what was happening. I decided it was best to just close my eyes, fall asleep, and pretend I had not seen the figure in the first place.
Story 9. Shadow Men Who Watched Me as a Child.
When I was a small child, around 1 or 2 years old, I had some imaginary friends. My family still tells me about them, and even though I don't remember the events myself, their conviction in the story makes me believe them. It's somewhat normal for children to have imaginary friends, but mine were anything but typical. According to my mom, when she asked me about them, I would respond with these complex, Russian-sounding names that a normal toddler shouldn't have been able to pronounce. My mom can't recall the specific names, but she remembers the terror she felt as I spoke these names. When she asked me if they were children, I would say, no, they're men. She would then ask me to describe what they looked like. My reply was always the same: they are all black, with nothing but red eyes, and they are very tall. One evening, while my family and I were eating supper in the kitchen, I suddenly stopped and stared out the back door's glass window. My mum asked me what I was looking at, and I told her a name I had never said before, another long, complex name. I said, "He's just standing there watching us." That was the only specific memory I've ever heard about from that time, and it still sends a chill down my spine. Though my family isn't religious, my mom remains deeply frightened of the imaginary friends I had as a child. To this day, she believes I wasn't just imagining them, but was somehow seeing dark spirits or entities. While I don't recall any of this, and it doesn't affect me now, it's unnerving to think that something so eerie could have been lurking in my early childhood. I can't shake the feeling that whatever I was seeing was not of this world. Believe what you will, but I trust my family's stories. And the unsettling thought that those things might have been watching me all along lingers in the back of my mind.
Story 10. Mystery of the Creature.
When I was in 5th grade, my dad gave me his old iPad to use as an alarm clock. He didn't need it anymore, so he let me keep it in my room overnight. I couldn't sleep that night for some reason, which was unusual for me since I usually fell asleep around 10 or 11 at night. At around 2:30 a.m., I found myself watching YouTube, the only one awake in the house with all the lights turned off. As I was browsing, I clearly heard the sound of my door creaking open and the click of the hallway light turning on. I always kept my door slightly closed because my room was right next to the hallway. I didn't look up immediately, assuming it was just the wind or something, but when I finally glanced up, I saw that the lights were on, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the most horrifying creature I have ever seen. It was tall and skinny, its body resembling the shape of a wraith. Its skin was a pale pink, almost sickly looking, and its red eyes glowed eerily in the dim light. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, making its already terrifying appearance even worse. The creature looked emaciated, with bones jutting out of its malnourished frame. It stood there, towering over me in the doorway, staring at me with an intense gaze. Frozen in terror, I didn't know what to do. I looked away, burying myself under the blanket for what felt like hours, trying to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally gathered the courage to look up again, the creature was gone. The lights, however, were turned off once more, but the door was still wide open. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that night, or if I truly saw anything at all. The strange things with the door and lights didn't make sense, and I never found any answers that could explain it. I moved out of that house years ago, but the fear never left me. I still sleep with my door completely shut now, unable to shake the memory of that night.
Story 11. Man in the Hat.
When I was a child, my family moved around a lot, and I never had any paranormal experiences until we relocated to rural Minnesota. We lived on 40 wooded acres that my dad purchased for an affordable price. To start, we moved a trailer house from a local trailer park and placed it on a temporary foundation while my dad planned to build a permanent house. Right from the start, I began experiencing strange and unsettling events. I would wake up to the sound of an owl hooting outside my window, only to see the shadow of a man standing there. The shadow was always accompanied by the owl's hooting, and it was never present without it. Occasionally I would wake in the middle of the night to find the man standing next to my bedroom window. He wore a wide, flat-brimmed hat, and his form was entirely black, a complete silhouette with no discernible facial features. He never moved when I looked at him, and I would often cover myself with my blanket, hoping to hide. But as soon as I did, he would move. If I peeked out from under the covers, he would be in a different position, completely still, as if frozen. These nights were terrifying, and I would eventually fall asleep, buried beneath the covers. There were also nights when we would hear a child crying outside. My dad would rush outside to check, but when he did, the crying would shift, now sounding like it was coming from inside the house. The whole family would search the house, but we never found anything. Sometimes my mum would wake up to it, thinking it was me or one of my siblings crying, but we were all fast asleep. My bedroom was located at the end of a hallway, and across from it, there was a small bathroom. The bathroom light would often turn on by itself, casting a shadow of a person on the wall, in front of my bedroom door. I used to think it resembled the character Big Bird because of its beak-like shape extending from the head. It wasn't too frightening at first until I realized that the shadow was, in fact, the brim of the shadow man's wide hat. I would only ever see part of his head in the shadow, so I didn't realize it was him, until one night when he stood slightly off to the side, and I saw the brim on both sides. At that moment, it became just as terrifying as him standing in my room. At first, I thought it might be my mom or dad, but they were both large, and the shadow man was incredibly thin. My siblings were also very young at the time, so there was no logical explanation. After 2 years of this strange occurrence, the shadow man began appearing directly next to my bed. I would wake up and find him right there beside me, and I would squeeze my eyes shut, frozen with fear. Twice, I felt his touch on my face. I could feel his hand near me, and the warmth of my breath would reflect off his hand and back to my face. His fingers would brush my skin, and in that moment I could see through my eyelids. It felt as if he was forcing me to see, to not close my eyes. After that, he would walk to my window and disappear. I still kept my eyes closed, but somehow I could see perfectly. I even managed to get out of bed with my eyes still shut and wandered around the room as if I could see everything clearly. It happened 5 times over the course of a year, and after that, I stopped seeing him. I still heard the owl at night, but I never saw the shadow man again. The strange events ceased, and I never truly understood what had happened. All I know is that for a while he was there, and I could see with my eyes closed.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.